Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this introductory IPUMS International webinar. Thank you very much for joining us today. A particular thank you to those of you who are joining us from other time zones where it might be quite early or quite late. We really appreciate you tuning in today. My name is Kristen Jeffers and I work as a senior data analyst on the IPUMS International project, and I'll be your guide for today's webinar. I'm also joined by Laura Cleveland, the IPUMS International Project Director.
Hi everyone, I'm Laura. I will be quiet during the presentation, but jumping in to help apprise Kristen of some of your questions throughout the webinar. A few of my colleagues are helping me monitor the questions, and we're really excited that you're all here today and we have this opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you. So just a few housekeeping items to cover before we get started. At the bottom of your Zoom window, you should see two buttons, one that says chat and one that says Q&A. Please use the Q&A feature to submit your questions. We will try to answer as many of your questions as possible live during today's webinar, but we're also going to share the complete transcript of all questions asked during the webinar with answers to all participants, along with a recording of today's webinar. So once the transcript and the recording are available online, we will share that information with everyone who is registered for today's webinar. So the plan for today is to provide an introduction to IPUMS International. We'll tell you what IPUMS International is all about and take you on a guided tour of the IPUMS International website, which is where you can go to build and download free, customized data sets containing individual level census data from around the world. We hope that by the end of the webinar, you will know how to register for access to IPUMS International data, browse the online metadata on the website, and create a customized data set. We plan to cover more specialized topics such as geography and GIS, the online data analysis tool, and using IPUMS International in the classroom in upcoming webinars, so keep an eye out for advertisements about those webinars. And I should also mention that a Spanish language version of today's intro webinar is scheduled for April 15th. So if you'd like to join for that, or if you know any Spanish speakers who might be interested in attending that webinar, please spread the word. So we'll pause a few times throughout the webinar to address questions, and we've also left time at the end of the hour for a dedicated Q&A session. And once again, please use that Q&A button rather than the chat button to submit your questions. So let's get started. If you're just joining us, you've just missed introductions. And I will say just one more time, please submit your questions using the Q&A button. We're very happy to receive those and try to address as many as we can during today's webinar. So IPUMS International is one of 9 data infrastructure projects housed here at the University of Minnesota that provide census and survey data from around the world. So each IPUMS project is unique, but there are a number of common characteristics shared across all IPUMS projects, and these are the features, I suppose, that really define an IPUMS project. So all but one IPUMS project distributes individual level survey and census microdata, and in just a minute, we'll talk a little bit more about microdata to make sure everybody understands that term. And these microdata have been anonymized, meaning that all information that might identify an individual, like names or addresses, have been removed from the data. And the data are harmonized across time and place so that data users can easily use the data in cross-temporal and cross-national research. Each IPUMS project has an online data extract system where data users can go to build customized data sets and then download those data to their own computer to use in their research and analyses. And each data project has structured, standardized metadata and documentation to help researchers make informed decisions when they're building their customized data sets, and also to help aid in the interpretation of results of research and analyses. Most IPUMS projects also provides an online data analysis tool Depending on how much time we have later on, depending on how many questions come through, we may or may not get to a demonstration of that tool, but we intend to do a separate webinar focused on that aspect of the project later on. So again, keep an eye out for an announcement regarding that webinar. And probably most importantly, all of the data we disseminate are free to registered data users. So before we go any further, I want to make it very clear that IPUMS is not a collection of pre-calculated statistics or tabulations. IPUMS is composed of microdata, where the unit of observation is an individual. So when you download a data set from IPUMS International, each row in your data file represents an individual, and each column or set of columns represents a variable that corresponds to that particular individual's response to a census or survey question. And in IPUMS, the microdata that we disseminate are organized into households, which is really handy. It allows researchers to analyze individuals in the contexts of their families and households. And microdata are, in general, much more flexible than summary or aggregate or tabulated data. You don't have to rely on those pre-published tables. You can generate your own tabulations, and you can do much more complex individual level multivariate analyses using microdata. So what is IPUMS International? This is a screenshot of the website, which we will get to soon enough. But IPUMS International is an effort to preserve and harmonize census microdata from around the world and make those data available for free to the research community through an online dissemination system. So IPUMS, very importantly, is an international partnership between the Institute for Social Research and Data Innovation here at the University of Minnesota and national statistical offices around the world. So the logos you see here on your screen representing national statistical offices, that's just a handful of our international partners. We have about 100 national statistical offices who have partnered with IPUMS to make their microdata more accessible to the research community. So typically, national statistical offices share with IPUMS a sample, so typically a file that represents 10% of the entire population of the country, sometimes more, sometimes less, but most often it's a 10% sample of the population. They share those microdata with IPUMS and give IPUMS permission to distribute these data to the research community through our online data access website. Additionally, we've engaged in some preservation and archival work, which is, we think, very important. We've worked with a number of countries to recover and repatriate data that were in danger of being lost or becoming completely unreadable in their country. So the image you see here is a photo of the 1973 census of Sudan. These tapes were being stored in a storage room in the desert, and you can see in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, there was this little hole, which meant lots of dust and dirt came in and damaged these tapes and made it impossible to retrieve the very valuable data that were stored on these tapes. So we worked with the Central Bureau of Statistics of Sudan to clean these tapes, digitize almost all the data that were stored on the tapes, and return that very valuable information to the statistical office and to the country. In Bangladesh, they had a slightly different problem due to the humid climate there. They had problems with moldy census tapes. And here we actually sent a team of experts to the Bureau of Statistics, set up a facility to wash and clean these tapes, and were able to digitize and recover, I think, almost all of the data. So thanks to these preservation efforts and the cooperation of national statistical offices all around the world, IPUMS has assembled the world's largest collection of international census microdata. So the map on your screen shows you all the countries that are participating in IPUMS International at the moment. The countries in dark blue are countries for which there are currently microdata available on our website. Today, you could go online and download a data set that includes data from any of those countries in dark blue. The countries that are in light blue, which may be difficult to see on your screen, they're concentrated here in Northern Europe, are countries for which we only have historical data available. And by historical data, we mean really old data, data from the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. And the countries that are in green are countries that have agreed to participate in our project, but for one reason or another, we have not yet added those data to the online database yet. But hopefully many of those countries will become available soon in the next few years. So in total, we have 365 censuses from 94 countries and more than 1 billion individuals in the IPUMS International database. So the signature activity of IPUMS is to harmonize variables across countries and over time. So harmonization refers to this process of making data from different countries and different years comparable by assigning consistent codes and labels. So if we take the example of marital status, here are the original codes for Bangladesh 2011, Mexico 1970, and Kenya 1999. And you can see that each code means something different in each census sample. In each census, they are completely inconsistent. And of course they are. We wouldn't expect any sort of coordination across these countries in completely different regions of the world in their census data processing efforts. Nonetheless, the research community, you as researchers, would spend a lot of time recoding these data to make them fit for purpose in any sort of comparative cross-national research project. So that's where IPUMS comes in. We try to relieve researchers of this burden by taking the original country-specific coding schemes, aligning codes that have the same meaning, and assigning a new code and label that is applied to every census sample in the IPUMS International database. So here on the screen, we just see 3, but the idea is that all 365 censuses, and marital status is a variable that is included in almost every census in the world. So in this case, it truly would be across 365 censuses, we would apply this new code 100 to mean single across every census sample in the database. But when we get to marriage, it's a little bit more complicated. Each census has a different level of detail that they collect, and each country has different aspects of marriage that they care about. So to preserve the original detail collected in these censuses, we use a composite coding system where the first digit provides information that's available across all samples. So in this case, the 2 for 200, married or in union, that would be consistent across every sample in the database. The second digit provides additional information available in a broad subset of samples, in this case distinguishing between formal marriage and consensual union. And then the third digit provides information that's really only rarely available, or it might be country or region specific. So the researcher gets a nice, consistent, harmonized variable that applies to every single country in the data set they download from our website. And when we have these composite coding variables, it may be the case that the researcher doesn't need all this detail. You know, if you're using marital status just as a independent or control variable in an analysis, you might just want the simplified, very widely comparable 1-digit version of marital status. So most census samples we receive provide some information about the geographic location of individuals and households, which is great. It allows researchers to look at trends and calculate statistics and analyses, not just at the national level, but at the subnational level as well. But it's not uncommon for the boundaries of these subnational geographic units to change from one census to the next. But if you're a researcher who wants to evaluate trends across time, it's really important to have a consistent spatial area to work with, so you can tell if the patterns that you're seeing in your analysis are true variation across time, or if it's just the result of changing boundaries. So in IPUMS, in addition to the demographic and other variables such as marital status, we also harmonize geographic variables across time. And when we do this harmonization, we consider these changing boundaries. So if you take this example from South Africa, this shows the district boundaries that were used in the 1996 census of South Africa. District is the second administrative level, province is the first. By 2001, the census map had 54 districts, and in 2011, it had dropped down to 52 units. So you can see that between censuses, some of these units merged or split apart, as well as boundary changes. If you look in this northeast corner of the map closely, you might actually be able to see on your screen some of the boundary changes that we're referring to. So what we do is create a single harmonized geography variable for district in South Africa to provide researchers with the option of holding space constant in their analysis. Of course, if you're looking at a single year only, you would want to use the year-specific district variable to preserve all the original detail. But if you're interested in trends across time at a subnational level, it's really important to use the harmonized version to hold space constant across time. And I will remind you, again, in case you missed it at the start, we are planning to hold a webinar dedicated to geography and GIS in IPUMS International sometime in June. So if geography and subnational analysis is something that you're interested in, keep an eye out for that upcoming webinar. So many of you are probably familiar with the census. You may have filled out a census form. So you may have a good idea already of what type of information is collected, but just to give you an idea of what topics are covered in censuses around the world, and what topics are available in IPUMS International, we can look at some of the variables data users most frequently include in their data extracts. So in addition to these basic demographic characteristics, there's variables related to work, education, economic status, migration, and household composition. This is just 30 of the over 1,000 harmonized variables that are currently available from the IPUMS International website. So these variables support research across many disciplines and areas, including population dynamics, fertility, mortality, migration, household composition, living arrangements, marriage, labor force participation, work, education, educational attainment, the economic and social correlates of demographic behavior, and vice versa, how demographic behavior might impact economic and social outcomes. And particularly topics, information collected in censuses in developing countries is an important source for research on economic development and monitoring the Sustainable Development Goals. So we can take a look at some recent publications that have used IPUMS International data to give you an idea of what people are doing with the IPUMS International data. So here is a paper that looked at the living arrangements of young adults in Europe. Another paper that looked at trends in child marriage across 31 sub-Saharan African countries. Here's an example of looking at the relationship between demographic behavior and social or economic outcomes. This paper looked at lone motherhood and educational outcomes for children in Vietnam. This is the cover of a recent report by the World Health Organization that used information on cooking fuel from IPUMS International to look at indoor air pollution. And this paper is an example of authors that used IPUMS international data in combination with data from other sources, which we're seeing that a lot more commonly recently, that this paper used IPUMS international census data with environmental data to look at migration, droughts and migration in the Caribbean and Latin America. So I'm going to take a break here before I move to the website to answer some questions, or let Laura answer some questions.
Great, thank you. Yes, we do have a few questions coming in. One is someone wondering whether people are or can be linked across censuses, either directly or indirectly, with names, date, place of birth, things like that.
So the answer at the individual level, no. Like I said at the beginning, we remove all identifying information, names, and even if there were a unique ID attached to a person, that wouldn't necessarily be available, and it wouldn't be consistent from one census to the next. So at the individual level, it is not possible to use IPUMS International in any sort of longitudinal or panel study. They are true cross sections of the population. And because they are samples, you know, if within one country, we could go back to South Africa. If we had a 10% sample of the population of South Africa in 1996, there's no way of knowing that we would get the same 10% sample of the population in 2001. That being said, you can aggregate, particularly using those subnational geographic variables that I mentioned. If you aggregate up to a geographic level, then you can do longitudinal or panel studies at a, you know, aggregate level, but not at the individual level.
Great. So how does the IPUMS collection compare with other compiled data collections at international organizations like World Bank, UN, etc.?
I would say the biggest difference is, as far as I'm aware, not many of those organizations disseminate individual level data. The UN and the World Bank have really valuable databases full of all sorts of statistics and aggregate data. But I think the biggest difference is that we're disseminating individual level data. And I think when we get to the website, it'll also become clear that the data extract system, which allows you to build these customized pooled data sets, is really valuable and really facilitates comparative research. And I think compared to other places where they might disseminate individual level data, as far as I know, they're still disseminating those data in probably country-specific files where a data user would have to download those data and pool them and merge them together themselves.
I'm going to add that IPUMS data are discoverable through the World Bank Microdata Catalog. So World Bank has compiled metadata and information about accessing microdata, some of which is directly accessible through their tool. But if you, all the IPUMS files are discoverable there, and the World Bank directs you to the IPUMS website. The other thing I think I will add to this question is, how is this different from getting other, I think we're different from other microdata access systems as well in terms of the harmonized data, but maybe you could say a word about this versus DHS or some other microdata access project program.
Sure. Yeah, I think because we spend all this time to harmonize the data, it means that our data kind of behind the scenes, when you get to the website, this might make more sense, but kind of sitting behind the IPUMS website is this giant database where all of the data are pooled already into kind of a single file from which data users can just pull variables and census samples that they need for their research. So when you download a data set from IPUMS, you open it up into your computer, everything is already pooled into a single file. You don't have to do any renaming of variables, any recoding of variables, any appending of files, merging of files, compared to, yes, if you're familiar with something like the DHS, which is a wonderful resource, If you go to the DHS program website, you have to download a single file for each survey you're interested in, pool those data together yourself, do any sort of variable harmonization that's required yourself. So IPUMS really gives a lot of benefits to the researcher by making kind of data manipulation and data cleaning almost non-existent.
Great. There's a question about how often, how much maybe we make errors when we're harmonizing data. Anything to say about that?
Well, we are human, and I think that it's something we take pride in, that our harmonization process, of course, we have tools and programs to help us do our work, but the decisions about, does never married mean the same thing as single, and is single the same in one country as it is in the next country? Those decisions are made by humans. Human brains are deciding which categories to align and what really means the same thing across countries. So, of course, we're humans and we make mistakes. We do have a thorough review process where we try to catch those mistakes before they get to the website. But of course, we make mistakes. And actually, as a data user, if you identify one of those mistakes and you let us know about it, we will send you your own IPUMS mug as a thank you for helping us improve the quality of our data. And of course, we update errors when we find them. And there's a revision history page on the website that we can look at maybe when we get there that would alert users to corrections or changes to the data.
And I'll say I've been at least one of the people receiving emails about errors, checking our own errors. And we have a number of vetting systems. So on the intake, we have vetting. We have more than one person checking the originator of the work's work. And we have output consistency checks of various kinds. And I have to say, we're not getting notified of errors every day. We're not receiving complaints, and we do have pretty active involved users. UN entities are using the data, people who are very careful. So like Kristen, I'll say, I don't think we make a lot of errors, but of course it's going to happen. We put corrections on the web when we do find something. If it's an egregious error, we would email the people that we've seen downloading the data and make sure that they knew what was happening. So a question about, I think maybe we'll just take one or two more for right now. How you decide on coding schemes, like where do the harmonized codes come from? How were those decisions made? Information about that.
Do you want to take that one?
Sure. My answer, the reason I kind of put that one up here is just to be able to let you know that we are consulting international sources for standards on coding wherever we can. So not every variable is complicated enough to have an international standard coding system, but where there is an ISCO, say a standardized set of codes for occupation, we will use that. We also attend meetings and follow all the discussions on standard recommendations by the UN and other international organizing entities, UNESCO for education, ILO for employment. And we do try to follow those standards and do this harmonization process in accordance with best practices. The other aspect of that is empirical. So we look at what's common or common enough across countries, and we write thorough documentation, which we should get to the website so you can see how rich that information is that's available. I think we might have a question that always gets asked, so we should answer it before we go to the web. What measures do we have for income from what countries?
So income is not that commonly collected in censuses. In fact, only very few censuses included in IPUMS International include that variable. The ones that come to mind are the United States, Mexico, Brazil, possibly France. We can take a look actually when we get to the website. We can browse through the income variables, but no, and that obviously is a very valuable variable that many researchers would love to have available from IPUMS International, but it's just not that commonly collected in censuses around the world. It's more often collected in labor force surveys or other household surveys, which is an opportunity to mention that we do intend to incorporate international labor force surveys from around the world into IPUMS International. Hopefully as soon as this year or next year, there will be certain labor force surveys available, which will have more information about income and other economic standing indicators and information.
Okay, we have a few more questions coming in, but we'll have another opportunity to answer some more questions for the end. So maybe we should take a look at the website.
Yes, let's get to the website. So this is the IPUMS International homepage. The first thing that you want to do when you come to our website is register for access to the data. So if we go here to the left side menu and click on user registration and login, we can view the application form here. So all IPUMS International data, all IPUMS data for that matter, are available to researchers free of charge. But we do require that data users apply for access to the data and register with us, just so that we know that trained researchers who will use the data responsibly are given access to this really rich data source. So we ask that every person, every data user gives us some basic information, their institutional affiliation, which is helpful for us. If you're affiliated with a university, whether you're a student or a staff member or a faculty member, or some other research organization, that's obviously a signal to us that you are one of those responsible researchers who will use the data well. We ask you to give us a brief description of your research project, so just 50 words. And once you have been approved and have access to the data, you have kind of unrestricted access for a full year. So even if in this particular case you describe a very specific research project and then your research interests or plan changes, that's okay. We are very interested in knowing the particular project that kind of brought you to IPUMS International, but the research description is also just a way for us to understand kind of generally what your area is, and it's again a signal to us that you will use the data responsibly. So we also ask you to agree to a few terms of use. So really we're just asking you to be good stewards of the data, not to redistribute them with any other people that aren't registered users of IPUMS, that you'll store them safely and securely, and that you'll cite IPUMS International as well as the National Statistical Offices. So once you submit your application, one of our colleagues here will review your application, and their applications are reviewed daily. So it's usually just a day or two before you'll receive a notification that you've been approved to access the data. Occasionally, we might follow up with you to ask for a little bit more information, but most typically, you fill out this application, and within a day or two, you receive an email saying you've been approved to access the data, and that means you can get started building customized data sets on our website. So, for the purpose of this demonstration, let's imagine that we are interested in female labor force participation and employment in Southern Africa. So if you were a researcher that came to our website with that particular research question or research topic in mind, there's a couple ways to get started. First, we go here to browse data, and this takes us into kind of what we refer to internally as the data extract system. This is where you will build your own customized data set that has just the variables and just the census samples that you need for your research. So, like I said, we're interested in work and employment. So there's a couple of ways to find variables related to work. We could browse through these menus. Maybe I'll zoom in a little bit.
I'm going to interrupt you because we did have somebody saying that they are sad they have to leave the webinar early. So we wanted to just remind you that the webinar will be archived and will be available if anybody wants to watch it or refer it to others. I wanted to catch this person hopefully before they left. So sorry.
No, that's great. Yes, and maybe it's a good opportunity as well just to interject and say if you joined late, please use that Q&A button to submit questions. We intend to have a good chunk of time at the end to answer more questions. Yes, so please submit your questions as we go. So if we're looking for variables related to work, you could either browse the menu. So variables are organized in our extract system according to whether they are recording information about a person or whether they're recording information about a household. So for household variables, every person in that household would have the same value for a particular variable. So for something like, geography, urban, rural, every person in that household, if that household is in an urban area, would have the urban value. But for person variables, this is information and variables that vary at an individual level. So you can see here, we could drop down and click on work, and that would bring us to a list of variables related to work and employment. But we also have a search feature where we could just search using a keyword. Here, I'll search using the keyword employment. And it's best usually when I use this feature, I just leave all the default selections checked. It searches through all variables and gives you a list that includes the word employment in the name of the variable, in the label of the variable, in the description of the variable, or in any of the individual category labels for that variable. So you can see very quickly, we get a list of 18 variables that are in one way or another related to employment. So on this screen, we can see the variable name, the variable label, and then each of these columns represents a particular census sample. So if I hover over one of the columns, you get the full country name and the year of the census. And an X in the cell represents or indicates that that particular variable is available in that census, and a dot indicates that that variable is not available in that census. And because we have 365 censuses currently available from IPUMS International, this screen is quite wide. We can scroll and scroll and scroll and get this kind of nice inventory of which work variables are available for which census samples in IPUMS International. But if we go back to our variable list and we click on the employment status or activity status variable, that seems like something that we would probably want to include in our data set. It brings us to this very rich set of documentation and metadata all about the employment status variable in IPUMS International. So on this front codes page, we see the individual categories and labels that are included in this variable. And similar to that previous page where we could see which countries included the variable, we can see here in each column which country includes each category of the variable, which across most of these census samples for this particular variable, the core categories of employed, unemployed, and inactive are going to be available. It looks like there's some variation when it comes to unknown or missing or the not in universe. For some countries, those categories aren't included. On this page, we can also see unweighted case counts for each census sample. this is really just for your own information and as a tool to use kind of when developing your analysis, so you have an understanding of how large the sample is, and you know, if there's a particular category you're interested in, are there enough cases in that category to support your analysis? These are unweighted, so they really shouldn't be used for analysis. This is metadata rather than data. And because this is a variable like marital status that uses a composite coding system, we do have the option of seeing the 3-digit version, which includes all sorts of country and region-specific detail about work. All right. The next tab gives us a description of the variable. So this is a pretty brief description, just indicating you know, what this variable measures. The comparability tab is where we get into a much more detailed discussion of things that a researcher might want to consider if they're using this variable in comparative research. So we give a general description of, you know, these are things that you should pay particular attention to, watch out for if you're thinking about using this variable in cross-temporal or cross-national research. In this case, for employment status, something important to pay attention to is the reference period, which means in the census, when they ask people about being employed, which period were they asking about? Was it at the time of the census, kind of meaning that day at that very moment? Was it the week before the census? That's very common. Was it in the last month? Was it across a year? Which you can understand that depending on you know, that reference period might matter. It might influence levels of employment, and it's something to consider if you're comparing trends across countries. We also provide a country-specific discussion, click here on Botswana, about things that have changed across time, if there were any changes to the question wording, the way these data were collected, if the reference period, it looks like here the reference period changed from one census to the next. So we provide this kind of general comparability discussion and also a country-specific discussion. The Universe tab tells us who was asked this question, or for which group of people were data collected. Generally, with employment questions, it's kind of most typically people age 15 and older, but you can see here it varies quite a lot across countries and across regions. And then the availability tab just gives you a nice kind of concise list of all of the census samples that include this variable. That's maybe a little bit easier to digest than the big availability matrix on the codes page. But you can see this is a lot of information with 365 censuses. It's a lot of information to parse through, and like I said at the beginning, we came to this website because we were interested in a particular region, which is Southern Africa. So we can filter out all of the information that isn't relevant to our particular research question by selecting samples. So if we click here on select samples, we can choose the exact countries and census years we're interested in. So there's a complete list, but if we know we're interested in Southern Africa, so we'll go to the Africa tab. Let's look at Botswana 2011, Zambia 2010, and Zimbabwe 2012. And when we hit submit sample selections, and we come back to the employment status variable, you can see that now instead of having a unbelievably wide screen that goes on and on and on, representing every census sample on IPUMS International, we have only the 3 censuses that we are interested in Southern Africa.
We have a really relevant question to this page.
Okay, yeah.
On the Universe tab, you showed us that there were different ages that were asked these questions, even in our subset of 3 samples. So does this mean that the variable isn't really harmonized with respect to those universes?
That is an excellent question. We, right, for the most part, we do not harmonize question universes. We don't want to impose what might be our idea of what the universe should be on the researcher, and like I said before, we really believe in this idea of not losing any detail that were provided to us in the original data. So we could say we're going to make the universe for employment status 15 and older for every single sample, but for countries that, like Zimbabwe, where we have information about people aged 10 and older, we wouldn't want to lose that information. There might be people out there who are interested in studying child labor, and that could be really valuable information to them. So this is why we provide the universe information, so that the researcher, according to their particular research question and the context of their, the region they're working in, they can choose to make the universe consistent if they want to.
That's why we love to do webinars, workshops, and show this website, because we think this universe tab is really important, and that it makes it quite easy for researchers to make a quick decision and define a harmonized universe for the question, but it gives them the flexibility to keep it open and take as much advantage of what's available. So that's why we're really glad people are listening in and get to hear this. We do a lot of work to make that possible.
Okay, I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions at the end. So I will quickly just go back to the two tabs that we didn't look at previously, which is the questionnaire text, which provides access to the census question and the enumeration instructions that are relevant to this particular variable. So we can see here for Botswana 2011, we have the question about economic activity exactly as it appeared on the census form. It's been stripped down and it's presented in a simplified text format. If you wanted to see the original form, we could click on this image button, and that brings up the original form. And I've happened to select 3 countries where English is at least one of the national languages, but for countries where their census form are in other languages, this would bring up the original language form, which can be valuable to some researchers. But we can see the questionnaire with the census question, as well as read the the instructions to enumerators, which can be really valuable, because oftentimes these instructions include information about, well, how is employment defined, and kind of breaks down the definition of each of the categories captured in the variable. And lastly, the source variables tab provides access to the original variables as they were provided to us by the Census Office. So most researchers prefer to work with the harmonized variables, particularly if you're doing any sort of comparative research, but it can be useful to look at the original data as they came to us. So we make those available to researchers as well. So once we've browsed all of the variable metadata, we've read all about the different comparability issues and concerns and thought about how we might adjust our universe. We decide that this is definitely a variable we want in our data set. We go here to add to cart. You can see that my data cart in the upper right-hand corner has updated. I have 3 samples and I have 2 variables, and that's because this is a composite coding variable. So you get, by default, you get the detailed version, the 3-digit version, as well as the single-digit version. And you can choose to exclude one of those later on. So just very quickly, let's add a few other variables to our data cart. I won't look at all of the metadata and documentation just in the interest of time, but looks like we might be interested in occupation as well. Let's add that. Something to consider here, I was thinking, well, maybe we might want to look at industry, but this dot here in the Zimbabwe column tells me that industry isn't available for that particular sample. So I maybe will decide to exclude that variable from my analysis because it's only available for 2 of the countries I'm interested in. Let's add a few demographic variables. If we're interested in female labor force participation, we'll definitely need sex. If we want to do any cleaning up of universes or looking at people of working age, we'll need age. We might also want to look at do some subnational analysis, not only compare trends across countries, but maybe subnationally. And because we are looking only at a single year from each country, we would want to use the year-specific geography variable rather than the harmonized variable. So you see here, we have this harmonized consistent boundaries variable available, GO1_BW, and then we also have the year-specific variable, which is what we would want in this case, because we want as much detail as possible because we're not looking across time in a single country. So let's get the Zambia 2010 geography variable, the Zimbabwe 2012 geography variable. And I think we're happy with that. Let's go to our data cart. So on this page, we get a really nice summary that shows us exactly which variables we have selected and gives us another chance to check that they are available for the samples we've included. You'll notice there's a number of pre-selected variables. We automatically include serial numbers, weights, and variables like country and year and sample that allow you to distinguish among the different census samples in your data set. So if we go to the next page to create data extract, there's a number of ways you can customize or enhance your data set on this page. The first thing I'll show you is here, this data format option. By default, we provide a fixed width text file that you can read into statistical packages. We provide you syntax to use to read into statistical packages. But you might know, well, I just want a Stata file. I always work in Stata. Give me this data file. You can choose Stata here. And then when your data are ready, you will download them already formatted for Stata. You can also do case selection. Like I said, if we're only interested in women, you might say, well, only give me women in my data set. I don't want to have to drop those cases when I download the file. So we can select female only, and then we just get, it just even further reduces the amount of kind of data cleaning and data cleaning work we have to do when we download the data. There's a few other customization features, but in the interest of time, I might just move on. Although really importantly is this option to describe your extract. Almost every time I make a data set on IPUMS International, I download my data and I realize I've forgotten a really important variable for my analysis. So if you describe your extract, it makes it really easy, because we save all of your extract history, to come back and edit that data extract rather than have to start from the beginning. So we'll hit submit extract, and you'll notice that I haven't been logged in up until now because all of the metadata are available to everyone. It's only when you actually try to get the microdata that we make you sign in. I will submit my extract. And this brings me to kind of my private extract history page. So this extract 103 is the extract that I just submitted. It's processing. It'll just take a few minutes. But I did submit a few extracts yesterday just to be able to show you what it looks like when your data are ready. When your data are ready, you'll get an email saying, your data are ready, and it'll include a link that brings you to this page where you will just find your data file ready to download. So I have a Stata file, I have an SPSS file, and then this extract 102, this is what it looks like if you don't select a file formatted for its statistical package. You get this fixed width text file, and then we provide all the different syntax files you can use to read the data into the statistical package of your choice. So I think I should stop. So we have a little bit of time for questions. Sorry we didn't get to leave as much time as we had hoped, but we will definitely answer all questions in writing and circulate that transcript.
Nika, we hope that you know how to go find some data and download an extract. A couple questions. I'm just going to respond to the first one because I almost added this info back to the universe question. It would be a good idea to have some global standard definitions. Working age population, say 15 to 59. also in place. And we have, over the course of the last year, been talking about what a set of those kind of variables should be. So I appreciate the suggestion and the affirmation. I think at least a variable defining that, so that you could say, you know, select by this conditional variable, if not versions of employment status that have a couple universe options. So that is something we've been thinking about, and I'm glad to hear that that would be a good idea. I think we will make it so very soon. Couple other questions. Is there a web page where prior webinars are archived?
Yes, this is the first IPUMS international webinar, but on the IPUMS.org website, which allows you to access all of the IPUMS projects, under the support menu, if you click on tutorials, you'll see the webinars that we've done. We just started in the fall of last year, so we've only done 3, but we will add this IPUMS International webinar to this page as soon as it's available. And there are also other resources. If you go to the IPUMS International website, on the left-hand side, if you click on Help, that will bring you to hopefully lots of useful resources. We have a video tutorials page where we have a number of YouTube videos available in many languages that kind of walk you through more or less what we just did together today, how to create an account, how to build an extract, and it also gives you access to our user forum where you can ask questions, and there's information about our user support, IPUMS@umn.edu. We have a great user support team that are always happy to answer questions.
Great. If an extract is still processing and I realize I made a mistake, can I cancel? If I can't cancel, does it slow down my future requests?
I don't think you can cancel, but you can revise, I think, automatically, and I don't think it will. I don't think it will slow down future requests. So, well, that is now available. But I think
you can revise immediately.
Yeah,
once it pops up.
I think that revise button is there right away, and it shouldn't have any effect on slowing down how quickly it appears.
You would be queued up afterwards, but most of them go. How long does it take to add a new data release?
We typically add 20 to 25 new census samples every year. So our kind of data processing cycle takes almost a full year.
Okay, with Canadian public use microdata files and other data now being licensed with an open license, will we see more Canadian data in IPUMS?
We hope so, yes.
Yeah, I think so. We're getting better samples from Canada for the census. And it's possible we have a time use, and as we start incorporating labor force surveys, we're hopeful that we'll have Canadian data in here. How do we apply survey weights when using different survey years from a single country or multiple countries?
Most of the samples that we distribute are just kind of systematic, every 10th household samples. So most of the weights are just inflation factors rather than differential weights or something that you might think of as survey weights like in DHS or other household surveys. And most often it's a national, if there are differential weights, those are calculated by the National Statistical Office rather than us. So we really just distribute the weights we've been given. But almost the vast majority of samples just use an inflation factor rather than a differential weight.
Do you have full census data from these countries?
For some of the countries for which historic data are available, we do have full count. If you go to the select samples page and click on historical, some of these, all of the United Kingdom censuses, those are full count. Many of the United States censuses are full count. The Scandinavian, I think, are as well, but none of the contemporary, so kind of 1960 to the present, those are all samples.
We have very limited agreements with a couple countries we're piloting to make some higher density and possibly full count files available through a more secure enclave system. So watch for potentially more news about that coming in a year or so. I think we're at 12 o'clock. Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think we are out of time.
Great crowd and great questions.
Yes, thank you so much for participating and for submitting your questions. And any questions that we didn't address live, we will respond to in writing, and we will circulate the entire Q&A transcript to all participants. We hope quite soon. And keep an eye out for upcoming IPUMS International webinars where we'll be able to go into a little bit more detail about some of these topics. And please feel free to get in touch with us directly if you have other questions. ipums@umn.edu is the user support email. So we'll look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Okay, I let the questions in between go to the.
We should have more time for questions. That was my fault.
You're really good. Thanks. You still move the PDF of the harmonization slide. Widows and divorced from Mexico may have been.
Did you see the thing about the widow?
That's what I'm.
Oh, you're
Funny.
talking about that one. Okay.
Oh, sorry.
We can still hear you.